In this video, I'll continue from our discussion on variation. This time around, we're going to solve questions related to variation. So if you haven't watched the part one of this video, I will advise you to do that because in the part one, we talked about variation in depth. We explained the various type of variation and we analyzed each part in depthly. So in this particular video, we're going to solve past questions related to variation. But I need to mention that these questions we're going to solve, they are going to be extracted from Test Driller SSC. This is an app designed for WAS candidates that want to sit for the WAS exam, and it has all they need to ace the exam. I'm going to be using a feature in that app known as the question search. With the question search, I can search for any question based on topic, and the app just figures that out easily and smartly. So I would advise you get the app to practice more questions. So let's get started. So this question I'm going to extract is from the first question we're going to solve is an objective question from the year 2001, and that's question number 5. So let's take a look at the question. If n varies directly as m and n equals 8 when m equals 20, find m when n equals 7. So this is a direct variation problem, and this is how you interpret it. N varies directly as m. So n varies, you use the symbol to indicate varies directly as m. Then the next thing you need to do is to turn this into a formula, which is n equals to, you remove the sign of proportionality, you change that to equal sign. But once you do that, you need to multiply by a constant, because every time you turn a proportionality sign to an equality sign, there is a potential constant that you don't know, and that constant needs to be multiplied to what you have on the right. So k times m is the constant. So the question now says, if we know n to be 8 when m equals 20, find n when n equals 7. So in this kind of case, you need to look for the value of a constant before you can do anything. Although there are shortcuts around this, but an easier approach to solve this is to look for the value of k, which is a constant. So the value of k is equal to n over m. So just make k the subject. Now, what's the value of k? The value of k is equal to whatever you have as n, which is 8, divided by whatever you have as m. So when n is 8, m is 20. So if you solve for k, you're going to get 4 here, 2, 4 here, 5. So k is 2 over 5. So we can confidently say that k equals 2m over 5. So that's the formula. So this is the final formula, right? So now we've got the formula. The next thing is to look for the value of any of the variable, depending on the question. So the question says we should find m when n equals 7. So we should look for m when n equals 7. So let's go about this. So how do you do that? So to get the value of m, you just make you substitute the value of n and you make m the subject. So what that means is we know n to be equal to 7. So what's n, right? So to get the value of n, you just say 7 equals 2 over 5m, then you cross multiply, and that gives you 2m equals 35, then m equals 35 over 2. And this can be written as in mixed fraction. We can this one, then that's for this is 17, whole number 1 over 2. So this is the answer, and that makes option C to be the correct option. So this is how you go about solving for m. But I'm going to introduce a shortcut that could help you in case you need to quickly solve this. For direct variation, there's a shortcut you can easily adopt to look for the value of any of the or any of the unknown. Now this is how you think about it. For direct variation, the constant is always equal to n over m. So what this means is I can say n1 over n2 is equal to n2 over n2. So this is for direct variation. So this only applies for direct variation. So what this means is you can avoid looking for the constant by just using this formula. If you use this formula, you can get the value of any of the unknown, given this is m1, sorry, this is n1 over m1 equals n2 over m2. So you can look for any of them given you know the order. So let's look at how to use this formula to solve the same question. Your n1 is the first n you know, which is in this case 8. Your n2 is the second n you are given, so which is 7. So what about m1? m1 is the first m which we know, which is 20. m2 is what we were asked to look for, so we don't know m2. So how do you determine m2? So m2 can be determined easily by simply doing this. Just substitute all those values into this formula. That gives you 8 over 7, 8 over 20 rather, equals 7 over m2. So you cross multiply. That gives you 8m2 equals 20 times 7. So m2 equals 20 times 7 over 8. Then 4 here, 2. 4 here, 5. That gives you 35 over 2. And that's 17 on over 1 over 2. So this is a very straight and let's say faster approach that can help you save time in the exam hall. So let's move on to the next question. Let's take a look at this question. That's question 40 from the year 2015. The rate of consumption of petrol by a car varies directly as the square of the distance covered. If 4 liters of petrol is consumed on a distance of 15 kilometers, how far would the car go on 9 kilometers of petrol? Okay, so let's break down this problem. So the first thing we want to determine is what type of variation is this? So let's look at it. The question says varies directly, right? So since we can clearly see that it varies directly, that's the statement made. It means this is a direct variation. So what are the two variables we are comparing? So the first thing we know is the rate of consumption of petrol. So we can call that rate of consumption of petrol R. So let R represent rate of consumption of petrol. Then that's the first variable, right? It varies, that rate of consumption of petrol varies directly as the square of the distance covered. So let D represent the distance covered. The distance covered. So now the next thing is we want to define the relationship. So what relationship between R and D? So let's look at it. So we know that, or we're told that the rate of consumption of petrol varies directly as the square of the distance, the square of D. So this is a relationship. So this is basically a relationship. Now the next thing I want to do is to determine the constant. So there are two ways. You can go the route of the constant, or you can use the shortcut I just told you of. If you want to use the shortcut I just told you of, you could just say R1 over D1 squared equals R2 over D2 squared. But let me go the route of calculating the constant. So to do that, you need to turn this into a formula, which is R equals KD squared. So now we've got the formula. Let's look at the information we now know, the extra value of figures we know. If 4 liters of petrol is consumed on a distance of 15 kilometers, so what that means is, okay, let's try to make K the subject. K is R over D squared. So with this information, you can get the value of K, which is the constant. So the constant can be obtained by just plugging in the value of R and D. So we're told that 4 liters of petrol will be consumed on a distance of 15 kilometers. So what this means is when you have D as 4, the distance is 15 kilometers. So we can use that information to calculate the value of D. So we substitute the value of R as 4 and D as 15 squared. So K therefore is 4 over 225. So if you plug this K back into the formula, you're going to get R equals 4 over 225 d squared. Okay, the next thing we are told is this: how far will the vehicle go on 9 liters of petrol? So if you have 9 liters of petrol, how far will the car go? So given that R, which is the rate of consumption of petrol, given that this R is 9, what distance are we going to get? So what that means is you should just plug in the value of R as 9 in this formula that we have, and that gives you 9 equals 4 over 225, then d squared. So the question is basically telling you to look for the value of d given the value of r. So let's solve for d. So this becomes, if you cross multiply, this becomes 4d squared equals 9 times 225. Then d squared equals 9 times 225 over 4. Then d becomes the square root of 9 times 225 over 4. So we can look for the square root of each part since we have division and multiplication involved. So this is, if you use the principle of sorts, you can, this is 9 and this is 4. So if you do this, you're going to get 3 times 15 over 4, over 2 rather, and that will give 45 over 2, and that will give 2, 2, 1 over 2. That's 22 whole number 1 over 2. That makes option A to be the right option. So let's take a look at another question. Let's take a look at this question. If x varies inversely as y and x equals 2 over 3, find when y equals 9. Find the value of y when x equals 3 over 4. So the first thing I want to do is to determine what kind of variation this is. So we are told that x varies inversely as y. So this is an inverse variation. So this is how you express it. You say x varies inversely. Inversely means 1 over that variable that they are referring to. So x varies inversely as 1 over y, as y, which is 1 over y. Now we know that x is 2 over 3 when y is 9. So but before we go into that, let's try to turn this into a formula. To turn this into a formula, then you just say x equals k over y. Just multiply by k, then it becomes a formula. This is a relationship. The one above is a relationship. The next one is a formula. So the next thing is to look for the value of k, which is the constant of proportionality. So how do you look for the value of k? K is equal to x times y. Is the product of x if you make k the subject of the formula. So that's it. Then another tip I need to give you is this. If you want to avoid getting the value of k, you can go this route. You can just say x1 times y1 equals x2 times x times y2. If you use this formula, you'll be able to get any of the x or y, given that you know the other. So I'm going to explain that later. Let's look for the value of k, then I will explain using this other method. So to get the value of k, just plug in the value of x and y. So we know that x is 2 over 3 when y is 9. If you look for the value of k, 3 in 9, that gives you 3. 3 times 2, that's 6. So it means if you rewrite the formula in term after looking for the value of k, you're going to get 6 over y. So this is the formula that connects x and y. So now the question is, find the value of y when x is 3 over 4. So when x is 3 over 4, we are told to look for the value of y. So when x is 3 over 4, the question is, what is the value of y? So let's solve for the value of y. So the first one to do is to substitute this 3 over 4. If you plug that into this formula, right, you're going to get 3 over 4 equals 6 over y. Then we solve for y. Let's cross multiply. That gives 3y equals 24. That's 6 times 4. Then y is equal to 24 over 3. Y is equal to 8. So the value of y is equal to 8. So let's see where the right option here is option D. So but then There's another way we can use another method to solve for this, and this method could be quicker than this first approach. If you use this formula, which is x1, y1, this is for inverse variation. For inverse variation, this is the formula: x1, y1 equals uh, x2 times y2. What this means is x1 is the first known value of x. So the first known value of x is 2 over 3. Then the second known value of x is what? The second known value of x is 3 over 4. Then for y, the first known value is 9. Then the second known value is what we don't know. That's what we were asked to look for. What's the value of this y when x is 3 over 4? So you can simply use this formula to just get it straight up. So which means you can just say 2 over 3 times y1, which is 9, equals x2, which is 3 over 4 times y2, right? So if you solve for this, you're going to get 6 equals 3y2 over 4. If you cross multiply, 3y2 equals 24. Then y2 equals 24 over 3. Then y2 equals 8. So this is just a relatively faster approach that can help you figure out any of the unknown without getting the constant. Okay, so have now that we are done with this question, let's move on to the next question. Let's solve another question. P varies directly as Q and inversely as the square of R. If P equals 1 and Q equals 8 and R equals to find the value of Q when P equals 3 and R equals 5. So the first thing we want to talk about is what type of variation are we dealing with here? So to determine it, look at the question carefully. So P varies directly as Q and inversely as the square of R. So this implies something. It means we are dealing with three variables. That's the first thing you should note. We are dealing with P, Q, and R. So when you have this kind of situation where one variable is determined by two or more variables, you know it's a joint variation. Now let's look at how the relationship is. P varies directly as Q. So P varies directly as Q. And means you joint. It means there's a joint variation here. And inversely as and inversely you just say times, and is in this case means times, and inversely as 1 over r squared. So why do we have 1 over r squared? Inverse means you should take the inverse of that other variable. So and inversely as r squared. So okay, let's break it down this way. P varies directly as Q, so which we've done here. And means times, right? Then inversely as the square of r. Inversely means 1 over, then you have the square of r, which is r squared. So this is how you build a relationship. Then to wrap it up, you just say P is proportional to Q over r squared. So now we got the relationship. So the next is to get the formula. The formula is P equals KQ over r squared. So this tells you the formula. But then we don't know the value of K, which is the constant of proportionality. So how do we get K? You make K the subject. So K equals P r squared over Q. So now we need to look for the value of K. So how do we get the value of K? You look at the question to get information. So you need to know the value of PRQ to get the value of K. So we are told that P equals 1 when Q equals 8 and R equals 2. So which means to get the value of K, you plug in P as 1, then Q and R as 2, 2 raised to power 2, then Q is 8. So this becomes 4 over 8, which is 1 over 2. So this implies that P equals Q over R squared times 1 over 2, which becomes 2 Q over 2 times R squared. So now this is the formula. So the question now says, we should find the value of Q when P is 3 and R is 5. So when P is 3 and R is 5, the question says we should look for the value of Q. So how do we look for the value of Q? Now that we've gotten the formula, the final formula that has the constant solved, you can look for the value of any of the variable. So let's plug in the value of PR and let's solve for Q. So if you do that here, you're going to get 3 equals Q over 2 times R squared, which is 5 squared. Then if you solve for Q, you're going to get this 5 raised to power 2 is 25 times 5 times 2, that's 50. So if you cross multiply, Q equals 3 times 50, and that becomes 150. So Q equals 150. So this is how you solve for this question. So let's solve another question. So let's take a look at this question. X, Y, and Z are related such that X varies directly as the cube of Y and inversely as the square of Z. So before we look for whatever is unknown, let's try to interpret this question and let's look for the relationship. So the first one to determine is what type of variation are we dealing with? Is it direct? Is it inverse? Is it joint? Or is it partial variation? So first, how many variables are we dealing with here? We are dealing with 3 variables. We are dealing with 3 variables x, y, and z. Now that we have these 3 variables, what does it imply? It implies that we are talking about joint variation. But before we conclude that, let's look at what the question says. It says that x varies directly as the cube of y and inversely as the square of z. So once you have a particular variable varying with 2 variables, and those 2 variables are connected with and, then you can be sure that you are dealing with joint variation. So let's interpret this. So what this means is x varies directly as the cube. Directly, this is how you express directly as the cube is raised to power 3, the cube of y, and means times, inversely as the square of z. So inversely means 1 over, then square of z. So z squared. So if you make this compact, it becomes y raised to power 3 divided by z raised to power 2. So this is the relationship. And if you want to take away the sign of proportionality, you multiply with a constant, and this is what you get. Now that we've got the formula, now the next thing is to look for what we need to look for. So the question says if x equals 108, when y equals, so you can imagine this to be x1, right? Equals 108, when y1 equals 3 and z1 equals 4. So the question is now saying we should find z. So z2 is the question when x2 equals 4,000 and y2 equals 10. So let's solve for this. So the first thing I want to do is to get the value of k. So let's solve for k. So to solve for k is to just make k the subject. So making k the subject is k equals, we cross multiply. Or let's do it this way. So let's say k, okay, if you cross multiply, you're going to get something like x z squared. Then making k the subject will give you x z squared over y cubed. Now we've made k the subject, let's solve for k. So k is equal to plug in the value of x1, all of this, just plug in the value of all of this. So that gives you 108 times 4 raised to the power of 2, then divided by y is 3 in this case, 3 raised to the power of 3. Then if you solve for this, you get 108 times 16 divided by, this is 27. So let's divide. So 9 here is 3. 9 here is 9 and 10 is 1. Then this is 2. Then 3 can go in 12. and that will give 4. So the answer is 4 times 16, which is equal to 64. So now then we plug this constant back into the formula, and that gives x equals 64y cubed over z squared. So this is the final formula with the solved constant. So the next question is to look for the value of z when we know x and y. So just plug in the value of x and y, then solve for z. So what's the value of x this time around? That's 4,000, right? What's the value of y? So this is 4 times y cubed. So y is 10 cubed, right? Then z is unknown. We are looking for z. So cross multiply. That will give you 4,000 z squared equals 64. 64 times, okay, that's 64,000. 64,000 with 3 zeros. And z squared equals 64,000 divided by 4,000. So if you cut this, that will give you 4 in this, that's 16. So z squared equals 16, then z equals the square root of 16, then z equals 4. So we can say that z is 4 when x is 4,000 and y is 10. So this is the answer to this question. So we're going to solve another question. So let's take a look at this question, which is a question related to variation. So the question says the cost of producing n bricks is the sum of a fixed amount h and a variable amount y, where y varies directly as n. So let's take a look at the question more closely. The cost C of producing n bricks is the sum of a fixed amount h and a variable amount y, where y varies directly as n. If it costs 950 Ghana cedis to produce 600 bricks, and it costs 1030 Ghana cedis to produce 1000 bricks, find the relationship between CH and N. So let's interpret this question. So the cost, we have cost as C. C is the cost, right? Then we have another variable known as N. N is the number of bricks. Is the number of bricks. Then we have H. H is a fixed amount. So you can call this fixed cost. You understand? Fixed cost. Fixed cost in the sense that irrespective of number of blocks or bricks you want to make, this cost will remain constant. So this happens a lot in the real world, where let's say for example you spend a particular amount to purchase an equipment. That equipment is a fixed cost. It doesn't matter how many bricks you make. As long as you spend that amount to buy that equipment, that amount is fixed no matter the number of bricks you decide to make thereafter. So now is the total cost is the sum of the fixed amount, which is H, and is also the sum of the fixed amount and a variable amount. So this Y is a variable amount. Now variable means it's not fixed and it is determined by another factor. Now this Y now varies directly as N. So with this variable amount is determined by the value of N. So the question is now saying we have certain data, and the question is now saying find the relation between CH and N. So now the one thing I need to make you understand clearly is this. They use a term for C. They said C is the cost of producing N bricks, and that C is the sum. They didn't say C partly constant. They said C is the sum. So when you see something like this, it means they are actually giving you the exact formula of C. They are not giving you a relationship, a kind of variation relationship. So what I mean by that is If, for example, they said C is partly constant and partly varies with, let's say, N or Y, then it means you are going to express in terms of proportionality, that is in terms of the sign of proportionality, then eventually you look for the formula. But when you are told that C is a sum of something, that the sum of A and B, it means you can directly say C is equal to the fixed cost plus the variable cost. That's it. There is no sign of proportionality in this case. But then there will be sign of proportionality for other things where you have varies, right? So in the case of y, they say y varies as n. So this is where we have sign of proportionality. Y varies as n. So now you need to turn this proportionality into an equality sign. So which means y is equal to kn. Now kn implies that k is the constant, and once you multiply by a constant, you remove the sign of proportionality. So now this is the relationship between y and n. But then we can substitute this value into this. So we can express C in terms of n as Kn. So that's C equals H plus Kn. So what this means is C is partly constant and C varies with n. So this is the formula connecting the number of bricks and the cost of making the n bricks. So we've got the first question sorted out, which is the relationship. So this is the relationship between n and y. This relationship between n and c. So let's take a look at the next question. So the next question is saying that we should calculate the cost. So given this extra information, we should calculate the cost of producing 500 bricks. So let's take a look at how to go about it. So this is actually a partial variation, but then the partial variation is turned around in such a way that we were given the sum, then eventually the part that varies is given as separate information that we combine. So let's solve for the cost of producing 500 bricks given the other information that we know. So let's write out the other information that we know, then we solve. So we know the first cost, which is C1. We can say the first cost is 950 Ghana cedis when N is 600 bricks. Then we also know that for for C2, that is C2 when we have 1,300, right? 1,300 as the cost. The number of bricks that we made happens to be 1,000. So the question is now, for us to calculate the cost, you can call this C3 when the number of bricks is equal to 500. So that is what we need to look for. So let's solve for this. Now this is a partial variation in some sense, and to get the full to get the value of any of the unknown, you need to solve for the constants. And here we have two constants. We have H, which is one of the constants, the fixed cost, then K, which is the constant of proportionality. So how do we determine these two constants? You will end up having two equations because to solve for two unknowns, you need two equations. So let's generate the two equations. So you plug in the value of C1 and N1, and you do the same for C2 and N2. So when C is 950, the value of n, which is the number of bricks, happens to be 600. So here we have h plus k times 600. So that's 600k, right? So we can rewrite it as h plus 600k equals 950. So this is equation 1. Then to get the second equation, you plug in the value of c as when it's 1,300. We have our number of bricks, which is n, as 1,000. So this is 1,000k. Then you can rewrite it this way: h plus 1,000k equals 1300. So this is equation 2. So now we've got the two equations we can solve for h and k. So let's solve for this. To solve for this, just subtract equation 1 from equation 2 using the elimination method. If you do that, you're going to get h minus h, that's 0. 1000k minus 600k, that's 400k. Then 1300 minus 950, that will give us 80. So the value of k becomes 80 over 400, and that will give you 1 over 5. So the next is to substitute the value of k as 1 over 5 in equation 1. If you do that, you're going to get h plus 600 times 1 over 5 equals 950. So h, if you simplify this, that will give you 600 divided by 5. 5 in 6 is 1. 5 in 10, that will give you 2. So that's 1000. That's 120 over equals 950, right? So h becomes 950 minus 120, and that's equal to 830. So this means we can express the full equation as c equals 830 plus n over 5. So this is the full relationship without the constant. So with this, we can calculate the cost for any given value of n. So now we know that for n equals 500, what's the cost? The cost becomes 830 plus 500 divided by 5, and that gives 830 plus 100, and that gives 930 Ghana cedis. So this is how you solve for this is how you solve this kind of problem. So we've come to the end of this particular video. So let's solve one more question before we end this video. So let's take a look at this question. Given that p varies as the square of q and q varies inversely as the square root of r, how does p vary with r? So this is the kind of question where they want you to look at how two things are related given that you have certain information. Okay, so given that p varies as the square of q, and then q varies inversely. Inversely means 1 over. Inversely as the square root of r. How does p vary with r? So how is p connected to r? We know how p is connected to q. We know how q is connected to r. And how is p connected to r? In the world of variation, you can easily substitute variation in such a way that if I know how p and q are related, I can plug in the relationship between q and r into this, and that will be correct. Even if I don't have equality sign, which means I can say p varies as, if I replace q with this, it becomes this. So p varies as whatever q varies as. So it means p varies as this. If you square this, you have 1 over the square of the square of the square root, and if you do that, that will give you 1 over r. If you take the square of the square root cancels out the square, and you are left with r. So which means p varies inversely as r. So that's what it means. P varies inversely as r, and that becomes the answer. P varies inversely as r, and that makes option D to be the correct option. So this brings us to the end of question solving under variation.